All right, so this talk is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I'm not going to talk about a machine learning method that solves a physics problem. It's almost the opposite, because I'll try to talk about things that physicists are actually very comfortable working with, but machine learning people maybe aren't, and are just sort of getting accustomed to it. But hopefully the two sides kind of equalize, and then we have back and forth between the two. So most of what I'll talk about are embeddings, which is basically just representations of different types of data that people commonly do for machine learning. The only difference here is that they're usually in Euclidean space, and now we'll talk about them in other spaces that are non-Euclidean. It's just at a very high level. The idea for embeddings is that you take some objects and you map them into vectors, and that's what you kind of need to do in order to actually use them downstream for any machine learning task. And kind of the classic example is words. So words aren't really mathematical objects, so normally you can't do anything with them. But once you embed them into some kind of vectors, then you can do things like add them, subtract them, sort of compare them. And then interesting kind of things fall out of it. So this is kind of the canonical classic example. If you take woman minus man, it gives you the same thing as queen minus king. So we've kind of mathematically rediscovered the concept of analogies. So then we could ask things like, what happens if we embed all sorts of different objects? How well can we preserve the properties of those objects? And in this talk, I'll talk entirely about these properties as being distances between them. So you're basically handed a bunch of distances between points that come from any kind of subject, any metric space, and you'd like to embed them into a space in a way that, in a continuous space, in a way that preserves those distances. And sort of the simplest thing we can think of is trees. So in this case, the distances are just however many hops you need between a pair of nodes in a tree. And if you try to embed these in Euclidean space, already you actually can't really do it that well. So that sounds a bit weird. Why is that? So let's try to embed this really simple tree. What this means is that we want a vector for each of these different nodes, and we want the distances to be the same as they are in this tree. So here, 5 to 7 should be a distance of 2, because you have to go back up to the parent 6 and down to 7. So if you try to do this, in order to preserve this 2 distance along with the 1 distances between 5 and 6, you'll need to make 5, 6, and 7 collinear. And then if you add 2 in there, you suddenly start having problems. So basically, Pythagorean theorem prevents us from actually being able to do this very well. And you can give yourself lots of dimensions. You can try to do this in 3-dimensional Euclidean space, 100-dimensional. But there's actually like absolute limits where you can't do any better. So surprisingly, it turns out, though, that if you switch your space from Euclidean to something else, and it'll turn out it's hyperbolic space, you can do an incredibly good job of this. You can remove that distortion. You can make it as low as you want. And you don't even need that many dimensions. In fact, 2 is sufficient. And of course, this is just for trees. So when we move to other spaces that aren't quite as regular as trees, or other graphs, then we'll have to do something else. But it turns out there's things we can do there too. The challenge, though, isn't to kind of identify the space. It's more about how do you work with these things. So how do you do these optimizations that people typically need to do for machine learning? What's an efficient algorithm for actually doing this? How does this scale up? What are the limits of what you can do? And then kind of what you do downstream in terms of operations. So this picture is kind of the intuition for why hyperbolic space represents trees really well. So this is one kind of model of hyperbolic space, the Poincare model. All the points in hyperbolic space live inside this unit disk. And what's going on here is that I'm plotting 2 points. I'm moving them out kind of toward the edge of this disk, which is the same thing as kind of sending them really, really far away from the origin. And I'm measuring their hyperbolic distance. And it turns out that as if I move these points far enough away, their distance starts being really similar to the distance between a point and the origin plus the other point and the origin. So in other words, the distance starts resembling kind of going back to the origin and back out. And that's really similar to trees, because if you have a sibling in your tree, in order to move to another sibling, you have to go to its parent and back down. So it's kind of the nice continuous version of a tree, essentially. Now you can do this with Euclidean space, but it doesn't do anything at all. If you just move the points far out, kind of this distance thing doesn't change in any way. So this is kind of the thing that limits Euclidean space, but doesn't really limit hyperbolic space, which is sort of neat. So kind of the takeaway is that hyperbolics are a very natural version of trees, but they're continuous. OK, so now the challenge is that we'd like to take this kind of simple image with an embedding of 2 points and make it something that's doable for lots of points, lots of data. Turns out it's not that easy, because at least for us machine learning people, hyperbolic space is still kind of confusing. The main challenges are how does any technique going to scale up? It turns out that there's kind of a key trade-off in terms of precision, which is how many bits we need to write down the coordinates of all these points. And then there's kind of standard things that we're used to in typical machine learning applications, and not only, like things like dimensionality reduction, which is kind of a standard thing you do with PCA. But for hyperbolic space, we don't have a clear notion of what PCA means, especially because it's not clear what a linear operation is. These spaces aren't linear anymore. They're not vector spaces. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about some of our ideas that shed light on these questions. So here's the first kind of thing we came up with. It turned out that basically to do an embedding of a tree, we don't even really need to optimize anything. The traditional approach that you'd use for these kinds of embeddings is to kind of start randomly, have a loss function that's based on how far away the points are from their distances that you're supposed to get, and then optimize that loss function. But if you're just using a tree, it turns out that you can actually analytically place the points where you'd like to. All that's happening here is I'm embedding each point of this particular tree. I'm picking the exact locations for each of the children, and then their children, and so on. So it's a really nice recursive algorithm for trees, and it also gives you distortion that's as good as you'd like. So here I'm actually getting an incredibly close set of distances compared to what they actually are in the tree. The only thing that really matters here is kind of this thing called scaling, and I'll kind of intuitively explain it. The only thing I'm controlling at all is how far away I'm placing each of the children from their parents with one single factor for all the nodes. So if I do it with a short factor on the left, then kind of everything is kind of mushed together. If I start moving them further apart with a longer radius, then they get separated better. And here, when I move things really far apart, they're super well separated. It might seem like those points that are close to the edge of the disk are actually kind of close together distance-wise. They're not. It's just that this edge actually has a lot of volume. So things can be really far away, even though they appear close to us in this projection of it. So the only thing that really matters is kind of this nice scaling property, which means that it's actually relatively easy to embed a tree in hyperbolic space. There's kind of a nice kind of conflict here, though, because if you scale things out, then you're putting things really, really, really close to the edge of this disk, which means you need more and more bits to actually write it down. And this is a big issue for hyperbolic space. If you think of the way you write down points in Euclidean space, in terms of how much it takes for a magnitude of d, you need something like log d bits. But in hyperbolic space, it's actually d bits, so it's exponentially worse. So it turns out there's sort of a fundamental trade-off here, in the sense that you can only get so much distortion in terms of the number of bits you have to actually write down. So this is that number of bits in this formula. It has something to do with the distortion, which is this epsilon. If you want to make it 0, this thing blows up. On the other hand, if you add yourself more dimensions with r, you can kind of cut it down a little bit. The two most interesting things are tree characteristics, which is this L, the longest path, and the maximal degree. The maximal degree is inside the log, so if you have a really big branching factor for your trees, it's not too bad. But the L is outside the log, so if you have a really tall tree, that's actually pretty bad. So basically, if we have these short, branchy trees, we're good. And if we have really tall trees, maybe not so good, unless we use tons and tons of bits to write down these points. So of course, in practice, it actually seems to work pretty well. If we embed this phylogenetic tree, which has a bunch of organisms and their relatives, then we can actually get an incredibly good distortion, very close to 0, much better than the equivalent Euclidean one. If we move away from the tree and embed graphs that are slightly less tree-like, then this advantage goes away. Eventually, you'll have graphs that are much better for Euclidean than hyperbolic. So this method's not really like a panacea that solves all problems. It just solves the ones that are especially tree-like. So this is kind of like what we figured out in terms of these trade-offs and how you actually embed trees. The other question we sought to answer was what we do about PCA. So the idea of PCA here is, let's say I actually have a set of points that I know is lying in space. I only get their distances. I don't know what their actual coordinates are. Can I just recover those coordinates or some version of them from the distances themselves? In Euclidean space, it's very nice. As long as you assume the points are centered, that they have mean 0, you can actually just factorize that distance matrix and you get the coordinates directly. So this is MDS or PCA. It gets slightly more complicated if you're doing this in hyperbolic space because it's not clear what it means for points to have a mean. Hyperbolic space doesn't have a simple thing where you can just add the coordinates and divide and have a nice mean like that. There's different means. So we have to figure that part out. And then we have to figure out what to do about the fact that there's no clear definition for PCA. Turns out you can do it, though. Let's say that now we're working with a slightly different model of hyperbolic space, which is this sheet. It's kind of the usual hyperbolic kind of shape. All the points live on the sheet now. You take a set of hyperbolic points, and then you define this kind of interesting mean on it. You basically take some point z. You compute a version of the distance from hyperbolic distance from all the points to z. You run them through this hyperbolic sine function and add it all together. Any minima of this expression actually turns out to have a mean property that we'd like to capture. And through this, we can get the same kind of nice PCA-like matrix factorization result. And then the algorithm becomes something really simple. You basically pass all your points through a hyperbolic cosine, and then you factor them the same way you would normally. So the cool thing about this is you can actually directly recover all of the points' coordinates, and you only need as many dimensions as the actual dimensionality of the points themselves. So basically, we've bypassed this hard problem of PCA in manifolds, and we can still kind of recover hyperbolic points as long as we know their distances. So this is sort of the dimensionality reduction side of the world. Of course, the classic thing to do in machine learning is just to write some simple lines of PyTorch and do an optimization. And this is kind of exactly that. The graph on the right is the same one that we used before, where we actually placed the coordinates. But this time, we're doing the actual optimization. It gives you the same results. So you have a pretty nice, it's almost the same results. The advantage of this technique, though, is you can try graphs that aren't trees. So cycles aren't really even that good for hyperbolic space, but you can just plug it in and try it out. And that's the cycle on the left. It's a bit bizarre because it's really hard to get a stable and nice representation of cycles in hyperbolic space. So that kind of led to the next part of what we were wondering about. What about other spaces? So cycles have a really nice representation in spherical space. If you have a cycle, you would just sort of wrap it around one of these great circles on the sphere, and that gives you a spherical embedding. And it makes sense because spherical space is somehow the opposite of hyperbolic space. So it has a positive curvature. Hyperbolic space has negative curvature. And this also relates to kind of how their volume works as well. And in fact, the differential geometries have figured this out a long time ago. There's these free canonical model spaces. They all have constant curvatures. Spherical is positive curvature. Euclidean is flat. It has zero curvature. Hyperbolic has negative curvature. And these all relate to this kind of notion of how volumes behave and how straight lines behave between them. This also is kind of the traditional way people thought about these spaces to start with. In spherical space, you have no parallel lines for a given point. In Euclidean, you have exactly one. Hyperbolic, you have infinitely many. So then the question becomes, let's say that we have some data that has a lot of different curvatures. It's not exactly a regular thing like a tree or a cycle. We'd like to combine the properties of multiple spaces like this, but it's not completely obvious how to do it. So the easiest things you could try are to take a product, and it turns out that it actually works quite well. So here we take one copy, or several copies of each of those different spaces, spherical, hyperbolic, and Euclidean, and you just take the product together. So for example, a product of two hyperbolic spaces is a torus. You can have higher dimensional versions of the torus. In this case, you have no really easy visualization for the products of all these things, but it turns out to be a pretty powerful and pretty expressive space. So the advantages are you get this kind of mixed curvature, which is, it means you can represent all kinds of different graphs. The distances, which are all that we've talked about so far, decompose really nicely. So the distance in this product manifold is the distance, just the sum of the distances for all of the different factor manifolds. And you can do the same kind of optimization that we did for any of them. The only kind of challenging thing here is how do we select how many copies of each of these spaces and sort of how steeply curved each of them are. And it turns out you can do things that are really neat in terms of looking at triangles. You sample things from your data, and you look at what kind of triangle they form in the sense of how the distances between the different pairs of points look. If they have this kind of somewhat fat behavior on the left, then they're actually, I switched these. The thing on the left is a spherical one. If they're kind of flat in the middle, it's the usual Euclidean one. And the ones on the right here they're concave inwards, are hyperbolic. And if you sample enough of these and look at how steep all of these things are, you can pick a number of representative spaces. So just in conclusion, for us machine learning people, all this stuff is kind of non-intuitive and new and different. But we're starting to make it a little bit more possible to work with these kinds of spaces in machine learning. So far, we've been focusing mainly on getting representations of data and doing some very primitive operations, but we haven't gone too far beyond that. What we'd like to be able to do is to enable a lot more interesting models to take place with this kind of thing. So I can imagine there's lots and lots of different physics problems that require you to have points that live in these kinds of non-Euclidean spaces. And hopefully, these sort of initial attempts that we've made help us actually solve those kinds of problems. I'd love to chat more about it if you have more ideas. Thanks so much.